It was a moment that sparked a national conversation about race and policing and left the family and community in mourning. 1 year ago this weekend in Ferguson, Missouri, police there, specifically Officer Darren Wilson, killed unarmed black teen Michael Brown. Protest and violence followed as residents asked why. To discuss where we are and what we have learned from this tragic shooting 1 year later, our political psychologist, Dr. Bart Rossi. We have Yohuru Williams joining us as well, returning for this segment, and also Professor Jackie Guzda is returning as well. Here we are a year later, and you think things would have gotten better, but there have been more cases of white officers, apparently not only black but white violence, and we've seen them on body cams and videos and so on and so forth. Have we made any progress since that shooting a year ago?
I would argue, given last month the fact that there were 5 African-American women, including Sandra Bland and Raynette Turner, who were found dead in police custody, that we haven't. The reason why we have this national Black Lives Matter movement that has really sustained its energy is because there have been all these incidents, and despite the body cams, despite the dashboard video, despite the national conversation, these incidents continue to play out in ways that force people to say, this does appear to be a war on black and brown youth, black and brown people in the public sphere. I think the video that really will resonate with people as we talk about, there are 2. There's the Baltimore case of Freddie Gray. There's a case from Cincinnati that we just saw where the officer shoots and kills this unarmed driver, and literally it's a case of murder and he's indicted for it. I think the progress is in the fact that we now have the video that people are watching, but really has anything changed since last August? Substantively, not really.
Well, I think the equation has changed because there is this video now, whether it be a private citizen or whether it be the body cam. But you talk about the incident in Cincinnati, and that was a difficult video to watch, and I think we all agree with that. But even with the body cam, something like this happened. Does it puzzle you that even though he knows it's being videotaped, he's calm enough to pull out his gun and shoot somebody?
It does, and you know, we've had guests, police guests on this show who have said no cop gets up in the morning and says, I'm gonna go out and shoot somebody, you know, kill a minority. You know, and that too you've gotta believe. However, you know, when you look at, in particular, that tape with Sandra Bland, that policeman escalated with his speech that situation. I mean, she got pulled over for not signaling a lane change. And he said to her things like, well, you seem irritated, like he was egging her on to get angrier and angrier, which she did, and finally said, you know, put down the cigarette, get out of the car. And so he escalated that. My thought with that was that if you have a gun, if you are there to de-escalate the situation, you need better training. I mean, what he did is something that we teach in basic 100 level courses in interpersonal communication, that you do not try to egg on that other person. And so from that little snippet alone, what I took away from it is that we need better training and that we also need a higher educational level for police. I looked up New York City Police Department. You do not need a college degree to be a police officer. I disagree with that, because what you learn in college, critical thinking skills, you learn how to deal in different situations, you learn how to deal with problems. And I think we need better education and better training.
Well, let me piggyback on that just very quickly, because I agree with you 100%, Jack. And I think the other piece of this is that when you look at that video with Sandra Bland, certainly that officer escalates it. But the other problem is, we can talk about his actions, but the system itself, the 8th Amendment has a provision against cruel and unusual punishment. Everyone associates that with the death penalty. But it begins with the question of excessive bail shall not be assigned. The minute that she was in trouble and she has a $5,000 bail to make, most Americans could not afford to make bail in that case. In that sense, once that police officer escalates this for a minor traffic routine, what he's created is a situation where this woman finds herself in the snare of a criminal justice system, which the Ferguson Committee, the Attorney General, found is problematic in the fact that it preys on poor people of color in urban communities.
There was an article in the Wall Street Journal today on that very subject, and we're going to talk about that in just a moment. But Dr. Rossi, getting back to this interaction with the person that the police officer stops, it was always my understanding that it's the police officer's duty to calm the situation down and get to a point where you can converse and get to the... But we've seen video upon video, including the one of the police officer pulling the gun at a pool party, which with kids, they're not concealing any weapons, where they make it worse to begin with.
Yeah, I just like to say first that there's so many good cops out there. They work hard, they try to do a good job,
and we all agree.
Sometimes I think it's skewed a little bit against them. But the bottom line is that you guys are right. You're right that we need more training for sure. But what's happened with a lot of these departments, there are guys and probably some women on the force who have what we call as psychologists retained anger. They don't really have feelings of being part of the community. They have their own personal problems and conflicts. They bring that in, they bring their biases in, and a lot of these, especially older cops who have issues, they present these problems. They pull guns. Some of the younger officers that are hired might be friends of somebody who was in the department. They get on the force, they're not as educated, they're not as well-rounded as they should be to be a police officer. The departments really suffer when they have officers like this in the department. And the only way to really resolve that conflict is better training and cameras. You notice that Texas, for example, really is fighting cameras on the cops because they want to be, they're so emboldened down there when they're thinking that they don't even want to have the cops have the cameras. And I think that's a big mistake. We need better training, we need cameras, and we need a better overall perspective.
It makes you wonder how many of these things happened before the cameras and the video. Yeah. And at that point, it's the cop's word against the suspect's word, and often the judge will go with the cop's word. But you wonder.
But you also can't incentivize arrests, and that's part of the problem here. I got pulled over in Harlem on Thursday by an officer who said, I made a right on red, and he said, you can't do that in New York, and he let me go, because he's there to serve and protect. Ultimately, then I believe that his ultimate concern is preserving my life and the life of other people who live in that community. When you have officers who are engaged in, and we saw this in Ferguson, it was the case in Baltimore, the systemic, and it's easily documented, arrest and basically preying on people in poor communities, then you've got to take a step back and go, this is just one manifestation of a much larger problem.
You're talking about an economic issue. The
Correct.
article today in the Wall Street Journal said the cops were sent out to write X amount of number of tickets because the police department was short on cash and they needed to make up the difference. That's when you get these $5,000 bails for a taillight. That's when you get people in jail waiting to get out because it's a money generator, and I think the whole protect and serve becomes, let's make a little money if we can.
Secondary, then when you run into the retained anger that Dr. Rossi talks about, you get a guy like Eric Casebolt summer setting into a pool party in McKinney, Texas in June, pulling his weapon on unarmed teenagers, and then clearly with the video on him, putting his knee in the back of a 15-year-old girl in a bikini. I mean, we really as a society need to take a hard step back and say, is this the way that we want to police our communities?
Now, and we have these individual situations, but we also have a community in Ferguson. I'd just like to bring that up. The community itself is biased, racist, problematic. Actually, more problematic than the shooting itself. I mean, at least Officer Wilson had some issues. He had something to say about this case. He had a lot to say that was pertinent. But the city doesn't. I mean, the city is seriously disturbed.
Well, you're exactly right, and you make a great point. Also, the video we saw following Ferguson, which was a year ago this weekend, our police in riot gear, bulletproof vests, helmets, the whole militarization of the police department turns people off when they're protesting, and they're protesting legally. I find that video troubling when I see that what is a legal protest and cops are surrounded there as if they're an invading army.
Well, something interesting happened in my neighborhood. We had a civic meeting in the community, and the police commissioner, Bratton, actually came to our civic meeting. And I saw a change in people's attitudes in the community. I mean, first of all, they put these lovely, adorable cops out front, and everybody's talking with them.
Do you mean handsome?
I was flirting with some of them, yes, I must admit. But, they were charming, and then to have the police commissioner there shows that he cares about our small community. And I just said at that point, wow, that's what every community needs. They need to know that this police force, which in New York City is 41,000 police officers, cares. Community policing.
We also need groups like a group in Cleveland that has brought suit against the city of Cleveland over the death of Tamir Rice.
Yes.
What we need, we had a national conversation on race after Trayvon Martin, after Eric Garner in New York, after Michael Brown, after Tamir Rice, after Walter Scott. At what point do we say we need national action? I think that's what Attorney General Eric Holder and the Department of Justice was able to do in that Ferguson report. Look, Darren Wilson, the legal system has spoken. Daniel Pantaleo, the legal system has spoken. These people are not guilty of murder. They go. But as a community, we have a responsibility to address these issues because they're impacting American citizens.
Well, you know, like in Richmond, for example, the police department there took it upon themselves to develop their strategy for their community policing there, and what that all involved. And they've been very successful with gangs and other people who are very problematic for the community. So each department really needs to get the right training, the right focus, and a strategy to deal with all of these issues. It hasn't happened in many departments.
And you talk about training. I've seen videos where the cops don't even say, I'm a police officer. They tase the guy first, taser him first, and then start asking questions, or they pull a gun out. We saw it in South Carolina where the suspect is running away and the cop decides, all right, I'll shoot him in the back.
And for
I
years,
spoke with the police officer, said, let him run away. We have his license plate number. We'll catch up with him.
there was no reason for that because, and that's absolutely true, with the level of information that police have at their disposal, that video was disturbing. But the problem is that now for years, African Americans and black and brown people talked about problems in our community. The rough ride, which we saw in Baltimore, the throwdown where a weapon is dropped on the body of a suspect. What we saw in Cincinnati, where after the incident is over, you hear the officer giving this account, this narrative of, well, he tried to take off. Mm-hmm. For years, those have passed muster, and we don't know, as you said in the beginning, how many victims of this type of violence we really can account for.
We have a minute. Big question, is there a solution to all of this? Dr. Rossi.
Well, I go back to the cameras, I go back to training. I like what you said about the police chief or the people in charge of the department going out into the community. We need to do more of that. But we also need to do psychological evaluations regularly on officers, not just when they get the job. I mean, what happens if someone gets a job
but then
and
you have to replace officers, which is a whole process in itself, when you have to look for...
Well, you could identify some problems and work with the officer. Some people who have drinking problems or other issues, you could start working with them.
Jackie, is there a solution?
I agree with everything that Dr. Bart said. I would also up the educational level and work with each kind of community, as you were saying, because a small community in the Bronx is different from a community in Manhattan as it is from a community in South Carolina.
Yohuru, you have the last word.
Every community needs a Ferguson-style study, and that study should address these issues of community policing, which my colleagues have talked about. People want to talk about all lives matter as opposed to Black Lives Matter. It's really Black lives that have been the centerpiece of this. If we privilege democracy, it's the right and just thing to do.
Yohuru Williams, thank you very much. Jackie Guzda, always pleased to see you is what I meant to say. And Dr. Bart Rossi as well. When we return, a quick look at some of the serious and not so serious goings on this week in the ever popular Fresh Outlook Lightning Round. We'll be right back.